I offer the call to the member for Durack.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker, and I'm pleased also to offer my contribution following the release of the latest Closing the Gap report. Deputy Speaker, there are 274 remote Aboriginal communities in Western Australia, with the majority of them located in my electorate of Durack. So they're located in the Kimberley, the Gascoigne, the Pilbara, the Midwest and also the Northern Wheat Belt. But, as we've heard, the gap remains very wide. Durack has the second largest of Indigenous people living in the electorate. Deputy Speaker, in discussing the Closing the Gap report, you're left with this sinking feeling that serious restructuring of the way we do things is required to address the difference between the living standards of Aboriginal people and the rest of the Australian community. The reorganisation does need to be transformational, and this government has made a good start on the right path. Need to focus on education and schooling, jobs and meaningful work with training opportunities leading to a job, not training just for training's sake. Safety and security in the community and in the home, and of course health and well-being. Deputy Speaker, only with positive, reliable and sustainable practices in these four areas will outcomes be realised and the breach will lessen, the gap will narrow. Now, this is an easy thing to say, but so difficult to do, as previous well-meaning governments have previously experienced. So let's take some time to look at the progress against the 7 targets as outlined in the recently released Closing the Gap report. Closing the gap in life expectancy within a generation, not on track. Limited progress and much more to do. Halving the gap within a decade in mortality rates for Indigenous children under 5, on track for the longer term. There's some good news there. Access for Indigenous 4-year-olds in remote communities to early childhood education, not met. However, noting the target is 95% and that all jurisdictions have committed to this. Close the gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous school attendance within 5 years. New targets have been set against the 2014 baseline to close the school attendance within 5 years, being 2019. Halve the gap in reading, writing and numeracy for Indigenous students, not on track. Alarmingly, no overall improvements since 2008. Most unsatisfactory. Narrow the gap in Year 12 or equivalent attainment, on track. The gap is narrowing, so some positive news there. And finally, halve the gap in employment outcomes between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, not on track. In fact, in decline since 2008. Very disappointing. So, Deputy Speaker, we see some improvement, but overall a pretty poor report card by any means. But frankly, if we can't get kids to school, which this government is working hard to achieve, and improve numeracy and literacy, Deputy Speaker, we should not be surprised that employment targets have not been met. But are the expectations of the system we have too low? What are the programs? Who's getting funded? And are these programs effective? Where is the accountability? These are the questions we've got to ask ourselves. This government is focused on answering these questions and quality outcomes for Indigenous people, but there is much more we need to do. That's obvious to all. To paraphrase Warren Mundine, Chair of the Indigenous Advisory Council, it's not about money, it's the fact that the money is not going where it's needed. And I sadly see that in my electorate all the time. However, there are others that add that in fact the problem relates mainly, in many cases, to culture. So many Australian Aboriginals are caught in a cross-cultural chasm, which complicates, confuses and compounds everyday life for them. Further, many are homeless, victims of family violence, suffering from alcohol or other substance abuse, or incarcerated. But pretty well most Aboriginal Australians, to some degree or lesser degree, find themselves wedged and then torn between conflicting ideologies. This ancient nomadic Aboriginal culture where land and ancestry are the essence of life and living, and this Western culture, like the institution of this very Parliament where we gather today to make speeches and to make the laws and the like, but it's not Aboriginal law, LORE, is not how a 60,000-year-old Aboriginal culture maintains their law and order. And Deputy Speaker, as lawmakers, we have to ask ourselves, are we addressing culture adequately and generally in our efforts to close the gap? It is my view that the practices and reform that are intended to reduce the gap must be brutally culturally appropriate and led by those who have the ear of Aboriginal Australians. What I'm talking about here is leadership, and I'm talking about opinion leaders. And I'd offer to this important conversation that we need and want more Aboriginal people to take on this leadership role. Perhaps for too long we have had politicians and administrators, mainly non-Indigenous, to be the ones to present the so-called solutions to improve the lives of Indigenous Australians. There are many brilliant Indigenous leaders in Durack, and I'd just like to take a moment to mention one young leader in Durack, a young man by the name of Torokana Bull Turner of South Headland, which is a mining town in the Pilbara. Torokana is a finalist in the 2015 National Youth Awards in the Youth Leadership category. Torokana has been nominated for challenging racism and disadvantage in his hometown by facilitating an outreach program known as the Hood Academy. Torokana has shone through with his passion and dedication, showing that age is no barrier to getting involved, to showing the way to be a leader. Torokana is a credit to our community and an outstanding youth ambassador across regional Western Australia. Deputy Speaker, we need more people like Torokana to step up and to work in partnership with communities, the non-government sector and the government. The federal government has commenced a program of real reform, significantly changing policies and programs for Aboriginals and Torres Strait Islander people. And as we've heard, the new Indigenous Advancement Strategy, we know it has 3 priorities: got to get the kids to school, adults to work, and making community safer. There's no argument there that they should be our 3 priorities. I stand behind the genuine efforts across all levels of persuasions of government to close the gap, and I share in the frustrations of those Indigenous and non-Indigenous people who have tried so hard to make a difference. The recent release of the 7th Closing the Gap report has heightened the disparity in health, education, employment and safety between Aboriginal Australians and the rest of the community. Despite the best efforts of previous governments, there is still so much more to be done to improve quality of life for all. We all need to work together to close the gap.